Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Page Turners Plus. As always, we encourage you to follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. You could find us there at Page Turners Plus. Today, we'll be reflecting on Lyonel Trouillot's Antoine of Gommiers, which was recently translated by Nathan Dees. And to tell you a bit more about the novel and the author, we have Paula. Paula?
Thank you. Lyonel Trouillot is a Haitian novelist, poet, songwriter, journalist, and professor of French and Creole literature. Antoine de Gommiers is a character driven novel, but I would argue that it is more a novel of ideas, primarily concerned with exploring the competing worldviews of the two principal narrators, the brothers Tony and Frankie. The character for whom the novel is named is the great 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 uncle of the brothers, and a seer of such great power that his name has become a national reference point. When we meet the boys, the family's fortunes have fallen. They are being raised in an urban slum by their single mother, who must often opt not to eat in order to feed her sons. Tony is a pragmatist with his 2 feet firmly planted in the ground. A man of action, he has no time for dreams. Frankie is a sensitive, idealistic dreamer who lives in his head. The novel appears to argue that being led by dreams and focusing on material reality are not either or choices. The novel seems to argue that both are necessary for human survival.
Thank you very much, Paula. I guess we could jump right into it. And I'm going to ask, is this a novel of despair? I don't know who wants to open the baton for us. I will.
I okay.
I, I'll say, I would say it's a novel of both despair and hope. Throughout the novel, I got the sense that there was some hope for the boys, there was some hope for Tony, there was some hope for Frankie, even in spite of the conditions of the slum that they lived in. And I also got the sense that there was also hope for what's his name? Is it Pele? Or Pepe. There was hope for Pepe because when he was first presented in the novel, it seemed like he was this terrible person, but towards the end, I don't want to reveal too much, when he assisted in in visiting the president of the historical society, I thought he was a really nice human being. And even when he was in the cafe, saving the woman from domestic violence, I thought, wow, this is a wonderful human being. So I thought there was a lot of despair, but there was also glimmers of hope scattered throughout the novel.
Um, though there were definite moments when I felt despair while reading the novel, the description of the slums, particularly, not even the slums actually, even when we were reading Antoine's story, there were moments of despair, but there were also lots of moments of hope. As Roger said, and there were glimmers of joy, and there were moments when I was smiling and laughing because I feel like the novel showed like the spectrum of the human experience. Yes, there's despair, but then there's love and humor and joy and you know life.
I also think it's worth flagging up that although there's a lot of tragedy and pain and suffering that the story takes place in the midst of, that there's also certain reality that's extremely difficult, that the characters are surviving, and so it feels realistic. I don't think it feels despairing so much as an accurate reflection of a difficult situation, and a beautiful picture of the people that live through that. And I really liked, in particular, the comparison between the people that lived in the alley and the people of the city. So the city of Port-au-Prince is really famous, right, as being a really difficult, and that's putting it mildly, place to live. And yet that's not where the story's set. It's set in a different, very difficult environment. And then they make this comparison when they go to the city, even they are made to feel like they have something. And so I think that's also all about relatives, isn't it?
I'm glad that Kesua brought up the point of the comparison between the alley, or the slums, and Port-au-Prince, and where the elites, or aristocrats of the time lived. Um, but I also want to focus on a bit more of the life in the alleyway. And I don't know if anybody else got Black Shack Alley vibes from this novel, but does the novel sanitize the beating of children by mothers of the alleyway? And that was constant throughout the novel. Almost every chapter you could see that coming out. Was that a way of does the novel sanitize that?
I didn't find that there was any sort of even an effort to remotely sanitize what was going on. I think it was, um, a matter of what happened, a matter of what life was like. There was no need to either gloss it or embellish it. It was just, for me, straightforward writing. Roger, back to, I don't want to take you back too far, but on the question of despair, I felt sometimes the glimmers of hope that you all identified, but that was more through dreaming. The reality of the novel was one of despair. I don't know if it's because I'm a practical person. So I felt the escape from the reality was through the dreaming that y'all were talking about, which is fine. But dreaming is not a strategy. You know, hope is not a strategy.
But there was
So
material
I,
progress as well, Tony. It's not just through dreaming that there was hope. There was material progress. Um, Certainly towards the end of the novel, there was a big
yeah, with
yeah. Hmm.
the work that was going to eventually get
Don't give it away
I
though.
I don't want to give it away. Yes, but yes. Yeah, so there was that material progress.
There is the sense that there are ways to exit the situation which are difficult, right? One is escape, literally to another country with legal or illegal paperwork, or falsified or genuine, should we say, actually. Let's take away the legality of it all, or death. So there is that sense that like there's a lot of pain where they are. I don't think we should get away from that. I think you're right in that sense. But people do survive that, and I think that's what the novel was trying to say, that like people can still, and also it doesn't make any bones about it. I think, like you say, the violence that we see adults inflict on children is a mere symptom of the same violence that other adults will inflict on other adults, is the way I
That's
understood
true.
the novel to be saying.
That's true.
And it's the powerless taking act
it's a
on the
reflection
less
of the condition.
powerless, on the less powerful.
Yeah.
It's also about power, right? Like the only people that these women are able to, because there's so much domestic violence that we understand in that situation, in that context, in this particular street that the story is about. The only people that women have any power over are children, and thus violence is enacted upon them, right? And in the same way that the men enact violence upon their women, and violence begets violence, and it's a symptom of poverty. I don't want to sound like I know what I'm talking about, but that's the way I read it from the book.
Wasn't anyone worried about the fact that Tony essentially made himself a sacrificial lamb for his mother? Um, he suggested that he provoked his mother to beat him because when she beat him, that was a release for her from the tension. She got to express fury. She had a way of expressing her fury at the conditions of her life. Am I the only one who found that worrying?
Well, that was certainly present in terms of the sacrificial that you said Tony made himself into. To be, I don't know if I was worried about it in the way that maybe it connected with you, Paula. But now that you mention it, it's a bit problematic, you know. Um, but at the point of reading the book, I just saw that as the ultimate compromiser who Tony seemed to have been anyway, right? Not just for his mother, but for his brother as well. So I read more that as a character trait of his. Um,
I
but
was
I
also
can see
worried.
where you got the problematic
I
issue.
I was also worried about. No, I understand that the author was explaining why there is the violence against children. I understand that what he was doing was explaining it, but I was worried that he might have gone a little bit over the edge beyond explaining um, towards explaining away. Um, that I found worrying.
Isn't there something in the character of Tony, who's one of our principal narrators, though,
It's
whereby he
not. I'm
is.
not speaking about Tony. I'm not speaking specifically about Tony. I'm speaking about because this is something we saw throughout the novel. Um, it was just normal. It was normal for mothers to abuse their children. It was absolutely normal. He did explain that it was the socioeconomic circumstances which led the women to these kinds of acting out in frustration. And in fact, there were preventative beatings. You remember the young girls worried about the burgeoning sexuality of the young girls and preventative beatings for that. Um, you know, like I said, I understood where the author was coming from, but I believe there may be a danger of explaining away, you know, um, going a little bit, yeah, beyond just explaining towards explaining away.
I have to say, I didn't get the sense it was being explained away because this is actually an area that I feel very strongly about, and I think if I felt like he was explaining it away, I would have really, my view of the book would have dropped significantly. I can't remember exactly, but I know there was one point in which he talked about how the children felt about it and like the fact that eventually they would be able that he explained how these beatings affected the relationship that the children then had with the parents later on, and I think for me that's where he was showing that it's not he wasn't explaining it away. He was saying, well, the result of this norm is that this is how your children are going to be with you later. Don't remember the exact part
Yeah,
of it.
he did say, for example, that there are some of the children um, walk around with permanent scars, not just physical scars,
Right,
and then other children basically went ahead and did whatever they wanted to do, regardless of the
right.
beating.
Yeah.
So, no,
So
I think he was very careful. He was very careful, but it did worry me. It did worry me that there are times when it felt to me,
true.
yes, as if he was giving the mothers too much grace.
Right.
I think I'm in a very similar position to Tony here, where it's only now that you mentioned it, Paula, that I'm very worried about what happened in the novel, because in reading it, I just assumed that this was just a legacy of post-colonial Haiti, just as it is a legacy of the post-colonial English-speaking Caribbean, where the eldest child often had to sacrifice so much, had to endure beatings from the parents because they were expected to be a third parent or even a second parent within the home. So I just read it in a totally normal sense that Tony was expected to be this almost like a second parent for Frankie. And because he's straight, he had to endure the beatings of the mother. And it was in a way a training for him to become Frankie's caregiver. That's how I read it. And now that you mention it, Paula, I think I definitely realize exactly what you're pointing out in terms of Tony being sacrificed. And it showed throughout the entire novel down to the end how those beatings and that sort of keeping in line forced Tony to become almost a Siamese twin of Frankie. And that brings me to my next question. So, considering all that we just had and just said, why does Tony bristle when the president of the Historical Society refers to Frankie's work as mostly fable?
I thought that was interesting because
Mhm.
Tony himself was, you know, not he was sort of dismissive of Frankie's work, often dismissive. Um, but I think the author is showing us chinks in Tony's armor. Um, Tony has his exterior, he's a tough guy in the family. He is the pragmatist. but I don't think he is as without dreams as he wants us to believe. And I think Tony also sees that there is practical use in the folklore and the whole mystique of characters like Antoine de Gommiers. Um, I think he sees I think he actually says it in so many words. He says something to the effect of, in his mind, of course, when he's responding to the professor's assessment of Frankie's work, he says something to the effect of, um, Antoine gives us hope. He gives us something to aspire towards. So I think he's just the author is actually really handles that very cleverly. I think it just shows the internal conflict that Tony himself
Yeah.
is having.
And I think you hit the nail right on the head in terms of the Antoine de Gommiers. The character himself is symbolic of the greatness that this generation could be, right? It's symbolic of their hope vicariously. That's what it represents. And at that point, when the professor is dismissive of it, if you want to put it that way, Tony defends it, because defending it he has to, because that is the hope that's embodied in him, that character that Frankie is writing about. So I think you hit the nail on the head there in terms of the importance of the character Antoine de Gommiers.
Isn't there also something about it's okay for Frankie to be disparaging about his brother's work, but who's Mr. Historical President guy to come in and say,
Exactly.
and there's also,
I'm black, and you can call me nigger, guess what? But nobody else, right?
right? And so there's something in that.
It's a bit.
But
It's a bit of that.
and I think there's a third thing perhaps going on as well, a little bit, which is that for all of the story, we're led to believe that, I don't know if this is a spoiler. In fact, I'll avoid the spoiler bit. Something that Tony has not understood for what we think is about half of the novel, the professor understands in sort of 20 minutes. And throughout the novel, we have this kind of balancing of the kind of hyper cerebral characters. The professor is one of them. So not the professor, the president of the Historical Society, the brother Frankie, the maître comptable. These really, they live in almost a different world from Tony and them. And those words, where the world and we Tony doesn't we don't, because we're following Tony's narration a lot of the time. We don't see where the fissure is between those two worlds until that moment, I think. Do you know what I mean? I don't know if I'm not making sense now because I'm not giving
So
enough away.
I don't agree with you that we're always
Yeah.
following Tony, because when all the narrative about Antoine de Gommiers is from Frankie.
No, sorry.
Tony, mhm.
I mean those two kind of adjacent narratives. But we I think maybe people read it differently. I, for one, was kind of like, I don't get Frankie's narrative. I was following Tony. I was like, this makes sense. Maybe that's my brain. I was like, I don't know, there's all this big words business.
Well,
And
there's
so,
definitely two parallel narratives going on. There's this one of the present,
and one's in
which
the
is
past,
Tony's
right?
narrative, and
But there are a
Frankie's
lot of
is
flashbacks,
yeah,
though. I don't know that
right.
it wasn't anything close to linear. There were a lot of flashbacks.
And I think that's the point of the novel, isn't it?
Mhm.
That like it's about the blurring of the lines between history and reality. That's kind of the big
Right.
thrust. And so you are left
Mhm.
going, hang on, what's true and what's not true?
Right.
Um,
History, reality, fable, myth,
And dream.
all of and dream, all those
Mhm.
things are kind of intermingled and you're not really sure. And I think I read it kind of like you as well, Kesua, like like Tony's narrative was to me, and obviously the author meant it to be that way. Now that I'm expressing it, that Tony's narrative was the more solid like this is what's really happening, and then the other narrative, which, as you said earlier, I didn't even realize was Frankie's narrative to begin with, was really, was, the more the dreamy mystical thing. So I think I was more, what's the word, grounded in Tony's narrative because it seemed like real life, whereas Frankie's wasn't. But obviously the author meant that to be deliberate, I think. Those contrasts.
And I think that the author meant to suggest that they're both necessary, that the views of dreamers is as important as the practical things that people like Tony bring to the table. I think he's saying that both dreamers and the pragmatists bring something very equally important to the table. That was my reading.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that he expressed that really well at the end when Tony had this long had a monologue, which he never actually said. It was all in his head, but he was expressing exactly that, in fact. Yeah.
And
It's
in
about it.
fact,
Mm.
so towards the end, the dreamer's work turned into something that was materially valuable. So I think again he's making that same point.
And
Yeah, and this.
just sorry, Tony, just to go back to the why Tony bristled at um the president not taking the work seriously is also, I think part of it might have been the fact that he was hoping that this would be something that would bring material prospects to them. And so that's another reason why he was taken aback that the professor was like dismissive of it. Okay, this
But
Tony can go ahead now.
Yeah, well, this Tony, the point this Tony was trying to make was that we're talking about the two narratives. I found that the author, well, to me, this book, this novel is full of satirical, you know, writing, um, and I found a lot of the satire was through the narrative of Tony as opposed to Frankie. Right? That's what I found. I found,
I do agree.
yeah, I found Frankie more to be the mythical, the dreaming. I mean, is Antoine de Gommiers really? Did he really exist? You still have to ask yourself that question, right? I don't think that's a done deal, you know. Um, but Tony, the pragmatist, had very skeptical views on some of the the way that Frankie, the world that Frankie lived in.
you
So
you
that's why I
you
make that point. Yeah,
you must be forgetting the sons of the first and second secretaries. They were hilarious. Those are
yeah.
from
Well, that's true
Frankie's.
too.
Those are from
Yeah,
Frankie's narrative. That's
yeah,
not
that's
from
true too.
Tony.
That's true too. Yeah. Well, that was a lot of humor there for sure. You know,
I see
we have.
what Tony
Hmm.
is saying though. I think the way that I'm going to call him T Tony because that's what he's in the book, so we can distinguish. The way that T Tony was talking about life in the slums, I found it to be very, very satirical, very deprecating of of things. Like he had a really humoristic turn of phrase when he was talking about things. I do agree that I found there was a lot more satire and parody in his recounting of the specifically when he was talking about life and the relationships between people. I mean, when he described, for example, people like Magdalene who spent all her time lying down, and just the way that he explained, she was born lying down, and then he goes through this whole thing. And yeah, from that point of view, the way that he described all these things, I found it was lovely.
And Tony, that is another reason I don't think this is a novel of despair. This novel is often very funny.
That's to the skill of the author that like there's a lot. If you I got sucked in to the depressive part of life in the alley, right? And it took me a while to get unstuck from that. And maybe that's why I felt the way I felt. But the skill of the author Um, I that guy comes in for high praise from me. So one of the most brilliant books I've read in a long time, to be honest. Um, and the skill of the author, I think, is what sugar coated, if you want, to put that little caramel on the chocolate bar and made the thing palatable. The suffering, the poverty, the abject poverty, the despair, the squalor in which these people lived, to weave through that, um, and give you guys a feeling of hope. He's brilliant.
Can I
I
say, I just, since Tony is talking about the skill of the author, I have to talk about the translator. As we said, this is a book that's translated from the French. I started reading it in French. I was reading them simultaneously, but ran out of time, so I haven't finished the French version. I do want to say that the translator did a really excellent job in translating not just the text of the book, but the rhythm of the French and the voice. He was able to translate the rhythm and the voice of the French novel into English. It was like really excellent. So props to the author, obviously, but also I think we need to shout out to Nathan Dees, the translator, who, in my opinion, I mean, I'm not an expert, obviously, but having read both part of it in French and then I was reading them simultaneously, so I would read a French chapter, a section, and then read it the section in English, and really, he really was able to capture the rhythm and the voice of the original writing. I think that was really good.
This book gives me reminders and hints and memories of Anthony Joseph's The Frequency of Magic, in terms of the way Frankie was writing Antoine de Gommiers' memoirs. And even Antoine de Gommier, he gave me great bandit vibes. The way he was sort of, mystical and, you know, absent yet present, omnipresent. I don't know if anybody else got that sort of vibe from the novel. Even the rhythm and the way the chapters are structured, it definitely gave me hints of Anthony Joseph, The Frequency of Magic. I don't know if anyone else had that experience.
Now that you mention it, yeah, I can see some similar threads. I personally went to another book, the one that Paul had recommended to me, Transparent City, and I found, not, I don't want to say similarities, but an underlying story that's told about poverty. That's where I made that root connection. But many people write about poverty. I just think that this particular novel was so brilliantly put together. The satire, the poetry, the way the narratives flowed, the from the intellectual plane to the common man. It was just a brilliant 177 pages, I think it was. Really good.
Yeah, I don't. I got some Anthony Joseph vibes. Similarly, the metafiction, this kind of the unreliable narrator, the big kind of major character, definitely. But actually, it pulled me in a different direction. You mentioned earlier, Audrey, in the conversation, made you think of Joseph Zobel's
Blackjack
Blackjack
Alley.
Alley,
Yeah.
right? And I can definitely see the resemblances there. They start young, and in some ways it is a coming of age story. We see them as children and their innocence lost in various ways. So I definitely get that analysis. But actually, the book that when I was reading it, it reminded me of was actually a a non-fiction text, "Silencing the Past" by Michel Rolfe Trio, similar surname, perhaps the same family. A fantastic authoritative history, um, which is about the theory of history rather than actual history as in the past, about how we understand how history is constructed and the people that are marginalized from history itself. The violence of the archive is one of the things that people talk about a lot, and a lot of that comes from his work. Another Haitian writer. And I think, Tony, you said a lot of people write about poverty, and I would take umbrage with that because I think at the beginning, Paula, in her synopsis, said this is a book about ideas, and I would argue that it's not about poverty. The people live in poverty,
Well,
but
yes,
that's not
yes.
what the story's about.
So it's
That's
not.
a fact of their social
No, no.
situation,
Thank you for
and it
correcting me.
is a novel.
It's really a novel where poverty exists as part of the as a main part of the living condition of the characters. Right? That's what I meant.
And Keswa, you made an interesting point there about reading maybe the author's cousin's work, nonfiction work, and I was genuinely caught off guard when the president said, "Oh, this memoir is just fiction," because I was there thinking he's saying that because he doesn't live in the alley to experience the magic of Antoine de Gommiers. So these things that Frankie probably put in his memoir about Antoine de Gommiers, he would think, yeah, this is fiction. This definitely cannot be true. How people basically gathered at the Lakou and submitted themselves to the power of this man. So I think, so I don't know if anyone else got the sense that the president thought that was fiction because he was so far removed from that life in that particular area, or was it really fiction that Frankie wrote, or Frankie was just imagining things?
I want to give the president some grace because even though he did make that initial assessment, he says something to the effect that, this is mostly fable, right? Um, he then goes on to say, or to make the decision that there is room for this kind of narrative. And he says maybe we should start a department to do that. And he actually follows through. So I want to give him some grace. I think that the novel was making um, some very serious points about class differences and how people from different classes perceive things differently. So the novel was making that point, but I do want to give the professor some grace.
I'll also add that I think it's quite clear within the novel that a lot of Frankie's work is fiction, that the man that's been helping him write the book is a con artist who forges documents and he's been forging fake letters from the 1930s. And also don't forget that Frankie's narrative is set in his great great uncle's time, right? It's set in the 1930s. It's a completely different time period. And so there is no way that the professor in the present is going to know what that life was like, even if his family in that time would have come from similar humble beginnings. Um, yeah, so it's not in defense of the historical society. I don't think he does anything wrong. I think he just recognizes the document for what it is immediately. And that's, I think, a surprise to Tony and the gangsters that accompany him because they're also illiterate and they can't see a forged document when they see one because they're just not familiar enough with the text of the written word. And this man is dealing in archival documents, presumably on a regular basis, and recognizes a forgery when he sees one.
And,
And
and
go ahead, Paula.
sorry, but and to Pepe and other people from the village, Antoine de Gommier is real. He's a mythical figure to people who are educated, but to them, he is their reality.
I don't think he ever says the professor. We could call him the president. No one knows he's a professor. He's the president of the historical society, and these people are typically actually not professors. They're typically amateur historians who are very serious and become presidents of historical societies, but that's a different thing altogether. Um, he doesn't say that Antoine de Gommiers never existed and that this is all a lie. What he says is the particular document they bring is actually mostly fable. So I don't think the question is really whether or not Antoine de Gommiers existed or not, which is how Tony reads it.
No,
I think the question is,
I agree with you, Pessoa. I believe that Antoine de Gommier is a real person, and I believe that he was a celebrated person in his time. I don't think the professor. I call him that because it's convenient. I don't think he was suggesting that either. But he was. I agree with your assessment.
And I mean, I guess we could focus on some other characters, other than Tony and Frankie, and focus on Pepe a bit because I found him a really interesting character who made some interesting bursts on the scenes. So, what do you make of Pepe's matter of fact acceptance of the prospect of one day being humiliated and deposed? And I think it was almost juxtaposed brilliantly with the whole serving the king thing that happened at the beach. I sort of juxtaposed those two situations, and I was like, yeah, that is almost what it's like. And even juxtaposing it with the way the people worshipped Antoine de Gommiers. What do you make of his prospect of being humiliated and deposed one day?
I think it was indicative of Pepe's brilliance, um, because the novel is very careful to tell us that Pepe was not book bright. Um, but certainly he was very talented. He was the leader of his gang, and a very effective leader. Um, I think Pepe. I think it's the novel is pointing out different how intelligence can be expressed in different ways. That book bright is not the only kind of bright, and it's not the only valuable bright. The kind of native intelligence that Pepe has is also useful and powerful and impressive.
Not just useful, or to say the word also, but it probably is more powerful and impressive in the context of living in the alley, right? You need to be very street smart to survive, and to survive at, well, the relative top, if you want to, the top of the rank in the alley. So Pepe mastered that with his streetwise and his brilliance, as you call it, Paula. So I think if we are to juxtapose him with the intellectual Frankie, for example, um, Frankie had to be taken care of by these street smart people, otherwise he may have expired a long time ago.
And
So,
also the reason
yeah,
that he hasn't, the reason that he's in the situation he is because he wasn't street smart. Later on, T Tony is
that's the
gonna
point.
is gonna say, if only he'd been doing the things that we were all doing, he would have known not to get into that situation in the first place.
That's the
So we
point.
see that book
That's the point.
smart can get you killed if you have no street smarts to attach to it.
That's the point.
Absolutely. I also think, agreeing with you, Paula, about Pepe's brightness, being not confined to books or not attached to books at all. The fact that he's able to assess his future so clearly, and we don't know if he's going to cry about that every night, and that's what scares him, because all we know is that he reveals it, right? I think it also speaks to the fact that he understands what's going on around him. He knows the world he lives in, and he can see his place within it. He's under no illusions, and so there's something very clear-eyed about his assessment, as well. I think, and that's why he does. It's not he's under he's not power mad and blinded by his own position. He's quite clear that if he doesn't and also there's not. It also means he's got the choice of changing his ways before he gets to that stage, right? He's
And
got the choice of running away before he's forced away, because he can see what options are lie ahead for him.
Did you think that there was any likelihood that he would leave that kind of life? I think he accepted that was
Yeah,
life,
no.
and he accepted his role in this society, and he accepted the way he would end.
I don't know. You know me, ever the optimist. I felt like,
So you think he needed some sort of redemption?
No, I think he got the redemption within the
Chestnut?
book. That's why Roll J's such a fan, right? Because Tony tells us very clearly that this is not a nice person. He has done terrible things, and T Tony is able to collaborate with him, but he's under no illusions about who he's working with,
Right.
and what this might in the future mean, because he might owe him a debt now that he has to pay at some point, right? But I also think that Pepe has his own voice. It's very clear. He speaks. I mean, we understand his motivations. He says, I didn't want there to be two. There wasn't space in this room for two. What do you call them? Two cocks, essentially. And so that's why I did what I did. And it looks like I'm a hero, but actually, it's just that's how I operate in everyday life. And I did the same thing here. That man didn't know I was here, and that's why he behaved the way he did. So he's a hero to us now, because we're like, yay, he did a good thing, a great thing, even. But he's really just being himself, and sometimes that will do good, and other times, most of the time, it seems it does extreme bad.
I thought the interaction between Pepe and the, well, I call him the professor too. His secretary. Um, I thought that was a brilliantly described interaction with this seemingly naive lady who is dealing with somebody who could snuff out her life or break her neck or what have you. And she's handling that situation as if, this is not what I'm facing. I just thought that was just so brilliant the way it was written.
Uh, no, I was just gonna say in response to Kesua that I'm as much a fan of Pepe as I am understanding of his situation, and I think all of us here actually know Pepe is because we know people who weren't restricted by the confines of chalk and talk education. Pepe clearly didn't like his time in Met Kantov's class,
Class, yeah.
and he clearly didn't want the chalk and talk and the read the book, so he left the school and he became a gangster. Perhaps if he was taught a trade, as a lot of countries now are moving towards, teaching people who don't like the chalk and the talk, he would have turned out to be a different person. But I think I could understand his position in life where he was misunderstood by the education system, and he turned to where there was some sort of brotherhood, and that's joining a gang, becoming a don essentially. So that's why I essentially liked Pepe, because I understood his situation. But I think this was such a wonderful novel. We could have had like 2 hours of discussion on this. Unfortunately, though, our time on Page Turners Plus is limited, but we will be back with a treat when we interview the author. And so until that point, we say goodbye and thank you for joining us. Have a lovely day.